To fake your own identity, pretend to be a man, sell the Statue of Liberty and convince everyone that you are the heir to the royal dynasty. To make everyone listen to you without having either a voice or a hearing. These people deserve the title of the most skillful and convincing visionaries in history. In 2016, Meryl Streep almost won her next Oscar, in quotes, for the role of a very unusual lady. Her character's name was Florence Foster Jenkins, and she was incredibly rich, vain, and considered herself an outstanding singer. The key word is counted. Pretending and reincarnation are the prerogative of actors. But our heroes had nothing to do with dramatic art. They did not play in the cinema or in the theater. Nevertheless, they managed to pull off grandiose scams, surprising everyone. The American Ferdinand Demara became famous all over the world for his reincarnations. It's hard to even imagine how many times in his life he played different roles, from a prison governor and a surgeon to a Benedictine monk. He assumed other people's identities and titles, forged educational documents. And all this is not at all for the sake of material gain, but for the sake of respect for others. Ferdinand did not even receive a secondary education, but he possessed a phenomenal memory, a high level of intelligence and acting abilities that even Oscar-winning Hollywood actors would envy. For the first time, he impersonated another person when he joined the army, borrowing his friend's name. Ferdinand then enlisted in the Navy, where he unsuccessfully tried to convince everyone that he had already achieved the rank of officer. Not getting what he wanted, he couldn't think of anything better than to fake suicide and start over. Except this time, he started posing as a psychologist. Then he continued to change his roles: a monk, a deputy sheriff, a teacher, a lawyer, a childcare expert, and even a scientist looking for a cure for cancer. But his greatest fame came from a story that happened during the Korean War on the Canadian destroyer Cayuga, where he posed as a ship's doctor. When 16 wounded soldiers were brought to the ship, who urgently needed serious medical attention from a surgeon, our hero did not lose his head. Ferdinand performed major surgeries on his own, without even having a medical degree, which, of course, no one on the ship knew about. Not a single soldier died on his makeshift operating table. When the deception was revealed, the captain of the destroyer could not believe for a long time that his ship's doctor was not who he claimed to be. The most important thing is to believe in your fictional role. Florence Foster Jenkins, the famous singer of the 20th century, had no problems with this. She was not hindered by the lack of a musical ear and a pleasant voice in order to consider herself an excellent singer and perform the most complex opera arias. Florence was born into a wealthy American family in 1868 and has been interested in music since childhood. The father seemed to feel that nothing good would come of this hobby for his daughter, so he refused to help her in her career as a singer. But even that couldn't stop an ambitious girl dreaming of fame and full houses. She began actively preparing for concert activities after she received her father's generous inheritance after his death in 1909. And 3 years later, she made her debut as a singer. She rented halls in New York, Washington, Boston, and other cities, where she performed arias by Mozart, Strauss, Verdi, as well as works written by herself. The audience could hardly stand her raspy voice and complete lack of musical notes. However, most of the audience was amused by the self-confidence with which this singer performed. But Florence herself perceived laughter in the audience as a manifestation of envy. She was not embarrassed by the audience's reaction because she was convinced that she sings unsurpassably. Another evidence of her fantastic confidence in her talent was the recording of a record. Arriving at the recording studio, Florence refused to rehearse and set up the equipment. She just went to the microphone and sang. She performed each song once and then, after listening to the recordings, called them excellent. It was from them that the records were printed. Nevertheless, Florence Jenkins's popularity only grew. People came to her concerts to see a curiosity, a singer who has absolutely no talent. In the last year of her life, she managed to perform on New York's most prestigious stage, Carnegie Hall. At the same time, the tickets were sold out in record time, and the price soared to $20, which was a decent amount by the standards of the 1940s. If you were offered to buy the Colosseum today, how would you react? Most likely, with humor. There are plenty of crazy people in the city who think they can sell landmarks that are state property. And yet George Parker somehow managed to pull off such deals. For example, he sold the Brooklyn Bridge twice a week. He would approach tourists on the street and strike up a conversation. George would assure people that he was the owner of a particular landmark, showing them cleverly forged documents and lamenting the taxes that were forcing him to sell such an interesting property. He would immediately begin to describe in vivid detail the advantages of owning the bridge. For example, one could set up a booth and collect money from every pedestrian, or organize a grand fair, blocking traffic. The price he offered to sell the Brooklyn Bridge for varied greatly. He sold it to some for a modest $50, and the largest amount paid for the legendary structure was $50,000. The swindler was unmatched in his eloquence. He had a hypnotic effect on people. How else can one explain that, in addition to the famous bridge, he managed to sell Madison Square Garden, the Metropolitan Museum, Grant's tomb, and even the symbol of the United States, the Statue of Liberty? For a long time, the police turned a blind eye to the heir seller's deals. Law enforcement officers often had to show up at the Brooklyn Bridge and explain to the new owners that they had been duped. New Yorkers were amused by these stories. From the police's point of view, they were also instructive, clearly showing the consequences of illegal schemes. Nevertheless, 3 decades after the first sale of the Brooklyn Bridge, George Parker was arrested and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was greeted in prison with almost applause. The swindler was greatly respected not only by the inmates, but also by the guards. Rumor had it that even among the prison administration, there were people who were on friendly terms with him. The Catholic Church has always had its own strict set of rules and regulations, which stipulated that only a man could ascend to the papal throne. However, according to many sources, in the 9th century, the highest position in the church hierarchy was held by a woman for 2.5 years. Nowadays, it is difficult to say whether this story is completely true, as the Catholic Church flatly refuses to acknowledge that this scandalous event actually took place. A large number of written sources describing this unprecedented case were destroyed by the Catholic Church. Nevertheless, we know that the first mentions of a woman on the papal throne appeared as early as the 9th century in the Chronicles of Anastasius, the keeper of the papal library. Several centuries later, a biography of this remarkable woman appeared. Joanna Angelicus, baptized by her parents as Agnes, was born in 822. She was the daughter of an English preacher and showed outstanding academic abilities from childhood. She had an excellent memory, developed thinking, and oratorical talent. After her father's death, Agnes decided to continue his work. But who would listen to a female preacher? Even then, she understood perfectly well that she could only gain authority and respect by appearing as a man. Under the name John, she entered a monastery, where she perfected her knowledge of theology and philosophy. After some time, she moved to Rome, where she worked at the monastery of St. Martin. The young woman's intelligence and talent could not go unnoticed, and she was soon accepted as a notary, in other words, a secretary, at the papal court. Even then, she stood out from other Vatican officials who sometimes could not even write their own names, while she possessed erudition and literacy. The Pope himself quickly noticed this and promoted the young talent to the rank of Cardinal. Many male clergymen of that time could not even dream of such a thing, let alone a woman. However, no one suspected at the time that the talented and promising Cardinal, who had earned such extraordinary trust from the Pope, was keeping a huge secret. Before his death, Pope Leo IV named Joan as his successor, and the unheard of happened. For the first time in history, a woman took the throne of the Catholic Church. For 2 years, 5 months, and 4 days, Joan led the faithful with dignity, no worse than any man. And perhaps she could have ruled until the end of her days without revealing her secret, had she not fallen in love with the chaplain. The appearance of the fruit of their love was only a matter of time. When the Popess realized she was pregnant, she began to spend a lot of time in her chambers, seeking solitude. It was announced that the Pope was ill, but circumstances forced Joan to return to her duties in the 9th month of her pregnancy. A terrible epidemic broke out in Rome, and the common people were in a panic, begging the Pope to lead a procession with prayers for salvation. As the procession moved through the streets of Rome, the Pope suddenly fell and gave birth to a child. Opinions differ on the further fate of Joan. Some say that the enraged crowd, realizing the monstrous deception, immediately attacked the unfortunate woman. Others claim that the Pope managed to escape after all. She was sent to a monastery, where she spent the rest of her life.